Hello everyone, welcome to Lockdown Sees World. A few days ago, July 1st, is American Independence Day, was just celebrated. And today we talk about the US President Franklin Roosevelt. There have been two Roosevelt presidents in American history. One is President Roosevelt Sr., that's Theodore Roosevelt, the founder of modern America, whom we introduced in the previous sessions, maybe in session 109. If you're interested, please check when you have time. The other is President Roosevelt Jr., that's Franklin Roosevelt. Though paralyzed, he still rose from his wheelchair and overcame a domestic crisis and defeated Nazi Germany and Japan and made America the hegemon of the world. The two Roosevelt's presidents were cousins first and also uncle to nephew relations. Before Franklin Roosevelt's marriage, they were 5-generation cousins. Yet in 1905, when Franklin Roosevelt wedded with Eleanor Roosevelt, who was the niece of Theodore Roosevelt. On January 30th, 1882, Franklin Roosevelt was born in Hyde Park, New York. His father, James Franklin, was a successful businessman, and his mother was Sarah Durano, with his maternal grandfather, Warren Durano, also a rich businessman who originally imported tea from China and then made big money from opium and drug business in China. When he passed away in 1898, he left a large amount of money, about $1.3 million to his daughter, the mother of Franklin Roosevelt. The money, $1.3 million at that time, was almost equal to $100 million today. In 1887, when Franklin Roosevelt was 5, he followed his father to the White House to see the President Cleveland. Then the president might feel too tired after a long hour working, so he patted the head of the little Franklin and said, "Boy, no more as the US president when you grow up, because it's really exhausting." Ironically, this little boy, Franklin Roosevelt, would be the longest US president in the White House, and totally for 12 years. In 1900, Franklin Roosevelt enrolled in Harvard University and then transferred to Law School of Columbia University and passed the bar examination as a lawyer. Then he began his political career and was elected as senator in New York in 1910. He gradually inclined to the Democratic Party, and in the election of 1912, he endorsed Woodrow Wilson, the Democratic candidate, rather than his Republican cousin and uncle Theodore Roosevelt, and who rebuked Franklin as an ungrateful traitor. During 1913 to 1920, Franklin Roosevelt was appointed as Assistant Secretary of U.S. Navy during Wilson's presidency. With his effort, U.S. Navy developed rapidly. In 1920, Franklin Roosevelt and James Cox, the governor of Ohio, they ran for U.S. president and vice president as a Democratic candidate, yet lost to the Republican candidate Warren Harding. Then Franklin Roosevelt resumed his career as a lawyer and did some investment. So one day in August 1921, at the age of 39, when he had a vacation at Campbell Island, Canada, he jumped into the chilly seawater after exercises with heavy sweat, resulted in permanent paralysis of his legs with symptom of polio. The wheelchair would be needed for rest of his life. That time was his darkest time for him. Yet, several years later, with his indomitable spirit, he finally stood up on his feet. After therapy and with a metal frame prop, once again he emerged and engaged in American politics. In 1928, he successfully ran for New York governor, and in 1932, he won overwhelmingly the election of U.S. presidency and began his New Deal against the economy crisis that lingered for years. His New Deal policy was also epitomized as a 3R. The first R as relief, as the issue of unemployment, and the second, recovery, to stimulate the economy. The third one was reform, to reform the finance and banking system. From March to June 1933, and he signed a large amount of new bills to Congress ratification, such as a CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, with hiring of 250,000 unemployed youth. AAA, that's Agricultural Adjustment Administration, the raising price of farm products, and TVA, Tennessee Valley Authority, that's the largest state-owned enterprise in American history for new dams and power plants. The NIRA, the National Industrial Recovery Act, that's for business regulation. Besides, by the way of the fireside talk, he told Americans that by radio about his ideas about how to recover the economy and eased their worries and win their support. During his administration, U.S. government also reinforced the federal deposit insurance, stock exchange supervisions, and the Social Security Administration. These policies are still working even today. In 1940, he was elected for the third term, broke the tradition of the only 2 terms of presidency since first President George Washington. At that time, the world was in crisis, and in Europe, Nazi Germany invaded Poland, occupied France, and attacked Britain. In Asia in 1937, Japan invaded China, and since 1940, it pushed to Southeast Asia and drove away the forces of Britain, France, and Holland. America then was still in isolationism and unwilling to meddle with the wars in Europe and in Asia. Roosevelt patiently ushered the country into further readiness. In September 1940, America released 50 destroyers to the British. And since March 1941, with land and lease bill, and America had provided almost $50 billion assistance to Britain, the Soviet, and China. In August 1941, Roosevelt and Churchill, the British Prime Minister, met and made the Atlantic Charter. On December 8, 1941, Japan raided Pearl Harbor, and America formally joined the war. In January 1942, America, Britain, Soviet, and China convened in Washington and signed a Declaration of the United Nations. In the same year, the Allied forces began military operations at the North Africa and the Mediterranean Sea and swept away the Germans and the Italians. In June 1942, the Battle of Midway, the U.S. Navy annihilated the 4 Japanese aircraft carriers and achieved a predominance in the Pacific. In January 1943, Roosevelt and Churchill met at Casablanca, Morocco. At the end of the year, they attended a conference in Cairo and in Tehran. In June 1944, the Allied forces lined at Normandy for new battles in Europe. In November 1944, Franklin Roosevelt won U.S. presidency for the term 4. February 1945, Roosevelt attended the Yalta Conference and discussed with Stalin about the post-war issues and the United Nations, persuaded the Soviet to fight against Japan, and also promised a status quo for the Outer Mongolia. April 12, 1945, Franklin Roosevelt passed away at the age of 63. At the eve of victory of the Second World War, in his wheelchair, he guided America out of the hard time, and he came to be the leader of the war. As the saying, the times make heroes. Such a special time of Second World War made such a great U.S. president like Franklin Roosevelt. To Americans, Franklin Roosevelt had a personality so appealing. That's a mind so richly endowed and informed, a heart so warm and understanding. That's a spirit so unconquerable. Even his political opponent that admire that he was a great figure of that time. Theodore Roosevelt, as one of America's favorite presidents, had his sculpture carved on Mount Rushmore, South Dakota. Franklin Roosevelt, as one of the greatest U.S. presidents, was dignified as an assembly of great virtues. That's as an aristocrat like Thomas Jefferson, a populist like Andrew Jackson, a crafty politician like Abraham Lincoln, and a beloved figure like George Washington. Americans are grateful for having such a great president like Franklin Roosevelt, and in the coming year 2024, America will have a new presidential election. Hopefully, the candidates of the two parties, Democrats and Republicans, can both learn from Franklin Roosevelt and to meet the great challenges in domestic and in globe. We use a saying by Franklin Roosevelt himself as our epilogue. The only thing we fear is fear itself. So that all the fears should be dismissed. Here comes the end of today's program, and thank you for your watching, and see you next time. Thank you. Bye.